Barbara Hambly was first approached by Kevin J. Anderson at a convention to write a short story for Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. Apparently, when Lucasfilm heard that she was interested in writing a Star Wars story, they contacted her saying, well, why not a novel? And her editor told her to tell the story of the great love of Luke's life. Now, in the 80s and 90s, Hambly had written a number of fantasy novels, my favorite being the 1985 novel Dragonsbane, and she had also written 3 Star Trek novels. But it is a little surprising that Bantam would approach Hambly about writing a Star Wars science fiction story, because almost all of her works up to that point were fantasy, which maybe explains why Children of the Jedi feels more fantastical and esoteric than previous Star Wars books. Children of the Jedi made it to number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of April 30th, 1995, and was ultimately on the New York Times list for 4 weeks. Now, unlike a lot of the books that I've reread up to this point, I remembered lots from Children of the Jedi. I think that part of it is that, for better or for worse, Hambly created a very atmospheric novel, and between the disorienting chaos on the Eye of Palpatine and then the very Lovecraftian beauty of Belsavis, the settings that the characters find themselves in are very distinctive and really stuck with me. And on the Princess Leia costume count, Hambly also did remarkably well. We get descriptions of so many different outfits, from the fancy tabard and gown that Leia wears in the beginning on Ithor, to the more practical clothes that she wears on Belsavis, right down to after R2-D2's murder attempt, we get a description of the kimono she wears. However, I have to take issue with Hambly's description of Leia's hair color. She alternately describes Leia's hair as being cinnabar or auburn, which, at least from the original trilogy, Leia's hair, to me, always looked a very chocolate brown, and I never really picked up red tones in it at all, so every time that was a surprise. So, a brief summary. While the Solos, Luke Skywalker, and 2 of his Jedi students are on Ithor for the time of meeting, an old smuggler friend of Han appears, raving, a shadow of his former self, saying that they're coming to kill them all. So Han, Leia, and Chewbacca head off to Belsavis to investigate Plet's Well and the mysterious Children of the Jedi, while Luke, 2 of his students, and C-3PO head off to the Moonflower Nebula in search of these mysterious coordinates. Of course, things are not as they seem, and Luke soon finds himself in a struggle for life and death, at the same time trying to prevent the dreadnought Eye of Palpatine from coming to Belsavis and destroying everything. Children of the Jedi, at least from what I could see of the reviews online, is a very contentious Star Wars book. Lots of people absolutely hate it, and a very few minority of people absolutely love it. I found that I fell sort of in the middle. There were some aspects of the book that I really liked, particularly how Hambly dealt with Luke and Leia's characters. But on the other hand, there are some elements of the book that I really had to take issue with, that I both find don't fit well into Star Wars and just feel very bizarre. Not to the same degree that the Crystal Star felt bizarre, but just completely unfitting with so much stuff. And then there's the Nightmare Fuel, but we'll get to that. There was a weird sort of throwaway part in Ambush at Corellia where Leia was thinking about how her family now is all that matters, because growing up she always knew that she was just a foster daughter of the Organas and she never really felt like she had a place, which struck me as very odd. Everything that we've seen up to this point seemed to suggest that the Organas loved Leia and 100% considered her as her daughter. So I like that Hambly sort of built up more of Leia's backstory. She introduces three of Bail Organa's sisters, her aunts. We very much get the sense that Bail and his wife loved Leia. She has a memory of going to the time of meeting on Ithor because her father thought that that was something she needed to see. And she has fond and sort of grumbling memories of her aunts as well. I also like that Leia was doing so much of the investigating this time around. Han and Leia and Chewie are on Balsavis to uncover the mystery of the Children of the Jedi and also the mystery of why Han's old smuggler pal is completely lost his mind. So I liked very much that so many of the discoveries they made were because of Leia. Leia's tedious uncovering work at the archives gives him the first hint of what Roganda Ismarin is up to. And Leia also is able to quickly figure out that Roganda is the force behind everything that's happening. She also goes undercover, sort of follows them, is able to eavesdrop on what they're doing. She does get caught, but she has a lot to do, and she's a pivotal person. Likewise, I feel that in some of the novels, the authors didn't know what to do with Luke. It can be hard to take someone who's just inherently good and make them interesting, but Hambly makes him interesting. I think part of it is I actually like poor, broken Luke hobbling around the Eye of Palpatine, having to survive on his wits in the Force. I didn't mind that he was in such bad physical shape because I felt like there weren't any opportunities for her to go the Superman route with him. Luke is just trying to stay conscious, and he's not able to rebuild things and levitate things because he's got a broken leg and he can barely take care of himself. I also like Callista, although I don't like what happens in the end with Callista, but we'll get to that. The idea of an old Republic Jedi is very interesting to me. Of course, a lot of what she came up with was obviously retconned by the prequels. It's just more interesting to me that she had this very thorough training, but at the same time, her master let them sort of roam free. I guess it's the Platonic ideal of what a Jedi should be, that they train, but then they travel around and they help people. And that led to her death and her afterlife in a way, that she wanted to make sure that the Eye of Palpatine was stopped at all costs. And when her lover went off and was killed and she knew that she couldn't destroy it, she was able to stay around and make sure that at the very least she could stop whatever came next. And I like her personality too. I've seen people complain about her as that she's whiny, but I think they're conflating Darksaber Callista with the Callista we see in Children of the Jedi. Callista's not whiny. At the very least, Callista's accepted her fate. She has a good sense of humor. She's funny. She's smart. And she really is like a good complement to Luke. I also appreciate that Hambly, while she has the Solo children at the beginning, gets rid of them for the rest of the story. Luke tells Leia that he can sense that Balsavis is not a safe place to take them, so Winter goes back to Coruscant with them, and that's the last we see of them. I like the Solo children, I just don't want 3-year-olds and babies to be pivotal characters at this point. And I'm going to say, you know what? People say that Hambly's prose is purple. It's hard to understand what's happening. And yeah, there were parts where I got a little confused. But her descriptions are so visceral and real and created this very intense sense of setting and place for me that I liked it. You know, Belsavis is like if Iceland was a Lovecraftian nightmare. There's the Kretch, but at the same time there's these beautiful blooming plants and the valleys are growing and there's hot springs, but outside the valleys, like, you could die of frostbite. It's just such an interesting world. And the Eye of Palpatine, too, is so interesting. I'm not crazy about super weapons, and I'm not crazy about the concept of the Eye of Palpatine. There's this giant dreadnought disguised as an asteroid, and it's like, can destroy can't destroy a planet, but raise a planet. I don't care about that. What I care about is inside and the conflict between the will and the computers that Callista can control. How the will is like, I guess like Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but even worse. And then you've got, however unbelievable this may be, the brainwashed aliens who think they're stormtroopers. And some of them really think they're stormtroopers, like the Gamorreans, and some of them it didn't really take, like the Jawas and the Sand people. So at the same time that Luke is trying to get his bearings and figure out where Cray and Nikos are and figure out how to destroy the ship, he's also got the ship is like maliciously working against him and using the brainwashed aliens as it's like pawns. I don't know. The settings that she creates really stayed with me to the point that I had not read this book in probably over 15 years. But as I read it, those things were familiar and it was like nodding your head like, yes, I remember those. Han's okay. While I like how Luke and Leia are portrayed, I feel like Han he's not bad, he's just not as good as them. I do appreciate, though, that we learn that Han loves sports and that he likes hanging out in bars. I'm not mad about the Mara-Lando relationship. It makes sense coming off the Jedi Academy trilogy that you would infer that maybe they would get together. And I do actually like Mara in here. I love that moment when she realizes that Roganda Ismarin was another hand, and she is just absolutely furious. Grand Admiral Thrawn had brought up the possibility of other hands, and Mara basically wasn't convinced and not willing to entertain that idea. But when she realizes that there was at least one other one that she did not know about that was hidden from her, she's just absolutely mad. There's a little bit of confusion, though, for me with Mara's plotline in that she went to Belsavis apparently around the time of the Battle of Hoth, and she knew a lot of the smugglers there, which makes me think that Hambly was operating off the assumption that Mara became a smuggler much sooner than she did. But the way Zahn put it forth was that she really only joined up with Card's people a year before the Thrawn trilogy, so that timeline doesn't quite work for me. And Luke's students, in a way, it's interesting that we're just sort of dropped into Cray and Nikos' story with not really much background. It feels natural to me that there'd be people that Luke and Leia know, and yeah, we've always known them and the readers wouldn't know. But while that feels natural to me, it doesn't feel good as a reader because you just get so confused. There's this backstory missing. Nikos has apparently been a student for a while, but then why wasn't he in the Jedi Academy trilogy? I guess you could argue that he was one of the unnamed students, but... And while I like what Hambly was trying to get at with Nikos, that he was dying of basically a degenerative disease, Cray took all his memories and put it in a droid body and made the droid body look as human as possible. But at the root of it, he's not Nikos. He has all his memories, but when Cray is captured by the other Gamorrean tribe, and he's not able to do anything because at heart he's a droid. He can't overpower a restraining bolt. He can't do something that he's not programmed to do. So I guess it's sort of a question of, do droids have souls? The conclusion that Hambly comes to is that Nikos is just a droid, that the original Nikos is dead, that his soul is gone, which... Because then we need to talk about Callista. While I love Callista's personality, and I love her backstory, and I love the rapport that she has with Luke, the way the Force functions with her is a little tricky. We know from the Jedi Academy trilogy that Exar Kun, when he died, was able to imbue his spirit in, I guess, the pyramids of Yavin. So I can accept that as Callista was dying, she was able to imbue her spirit in the Eye of Palpatine. But Callista's not haunting the Eye of Palpatine. She's literally part of the gunnery computers. And so while people can almost see her spirit and hear her voice and talk to her, and I buy that a Force spirit could do that, I'm not so sure about the way that she's able to use the computers and talk to Luke through the computers. It just feels different. It feels like a Force ability that we haven't yet seen and that's not properly explained. In the same way, Callista's ending really bothers me. Cray accepts that the droid Nikos is not her lover Nikos, that the human Nikos is dead and gone. And so she decides that Nikos is going to go up the inclusion grid because a droid can be hit multiple times and keep going. And she's going to use the Force to make the grid misfire. But she doesn't want to get in an escape pod because without Nikos, she doesn't see the point of living. She's... So instead she decides that her soul is going to die and she's going to give her body over to Callista. So Callista basically takes over Cray's empty shell. And when she takes it over, her eye color changes and her hair color is starting to change, but Callista can now no longer use the Force. This really bothers me. It makes a character who seemed interesting, who seemed to have a story to tell, in the end become only a plot device for Callista's reincarnation. And Luke apparently doesn't have an issue with Callista being in the body of one of his students. And no one else seems to have this problem either. They're just like, oh, so glad that Callista can be with Luke. Oh, I'm so glad they're happy. This is really disturbing. It's really disturbing that everyone was fine with Cray essentially committing suicide and giving her body over to someone else, especially when Callista was so opposed to Luke trying to transfer her into a computer and take her off the ship because she was worried that there'd be no way to separate her from the will. But apparently in the end, she was perfectly fine with inhabiting someone else's body. And I guess when your soul takes over someone else's body, it just starts to change it in a way. Look, I liked Callista, but the ramifications of what she did, I cannot accept those. It just makes everything that happens with her from this point unnerving to me. But on the plus side, I think Children of the Jedi was the first Star Wars book to have a fade to black sex scene. I mean, before that, I guess the presence of sex was implied because Leia and Han have children, but cool, that's fun. So, adding it up, my thoughts on Children of the Jedi are, well, there's highs and there's lows. I love the atmosphere and the settings and what she did with Leia and Luke and even what she did with Callista. I'm not so fond of never-ending super weapons. Roganda's interesting, but Eric is sort of like a Darth Vader 2.0, and when one of your bad guys is a 15-year-old boy, he's not going to be very interesting or frightening. And Cray and Nikos' ending, as well as Callista's ending, I don't like because of the weirdness, the ickiness, and the moral implications. So, should you read Children of the Jedi? Well, I think your mileage will vary. Do you like ornate purple prose that sometimes you might have to reread some passages to figure out what she's saying? Or do you like a more straightforward prose style like you might find in the Thrawn trilogy? Well, if it's the latter, you're probably not going to enjoy this book. You might not even finish it. But if it's the former, go ahead, read it. I'm really glad I reread this because I really enjoyed an awful lot of it. So next time I will be jumping back into the Corellian trilogy by Roger McBride Allen with the second book, Assault at Salonia.